All right, we are about to get started. We just want to make sure that the live stream is live. All right, it's 1 minute past. I think let's all switch our cameras on, those that can. Yeah, Kenny, do you want to do us the honors of an official introduction?
Yes. So welcome to the second event of our public conversation series, South Designs, Planetary Futures. My name is Kenny Coopers, and I'll just say a few words before we move on to the speakers. South Designs is part of the Swiss government-funded initiative Governing Through Design, which supports critical and creative research on how design intervenes in everyday life worlds and planetary politics. And with this initiative, South Designs, we launched a call for projects to explore how design taught and practiced from the South forges planetary futures. And just to say a few words, over 150 teams from across the world responded to this call. 6 teams were awarded funding, and we'll have one representative of the team here to speak about their project today. The first event of this series was a roundtable, an opening roundtable with Paulo Tavares, Jennifer Gabriz, and Michael Uemedimo. And they've very much already and very well laid out some of the central questions of this series. Question about what is design, what or where or who is the South, what is the planetary, and where do we situate the planetary? So if you missed that one, I think you can look at our YouTube channel and link up to see that. So today, our conversation focuses on occupations as forms of design in response to systemic injustice. And the project team, Planetary Occupations, will discuss their work with occupants of Cissie Gool House, a social housing occupation in Cape Town. And this also includes a design vision from below or a counter plan for the site's future. And the team is in dialogue with architect and educator Nana Yaa Biamah Ofosu, and they will outline, I hope, an approach to ecological design that is unchained from the logics of property and accumulation. And I'll hand over now to Laura to give a more proper introduction to our speakers.
Thank you so much, Kenny. And yeah, welcome everybody again. Thank you for joining the second installation of this conversation series. And we are very excited to be introducing you to our first project, one of the 6 projects that we're featuring throughout this series. And representing this project is Dr. Soraya Sheba. Soraya is a senior lecturer at the Department of Environmental and Geographical Science at the University of Cape Town. And Soraya is interested in urban socio-material struggles in emancipatory futures. And she has also explored this through a focus on the politics and struggles over both water and housing infrastructure. And it's the second one that she probably will hone on more today. A central research interest of hers is in urban occupations and movements, where she has sought to undertake more comparative and collaborative research across cities of the Global South as part of the City Occupied project. And she'll be speaking a little bit more to that in a minute. And she aims to continue and advance this work guided by a commitment to engage scholarship and comparative dialogue. And Soraya has also been an Urban Studies Foundation fellow that has been affiliated to the University of Amsterdam in 2022. Soraya will be in conversation with Nana Yaa Biamah Ofosu, who is an architect, educator, researcher, and writer. She's also the director of Yaa Project, which is an architecture practice based in London, which is dedicated to exploring counter-histories, material and diasporic culture through making, speaking, and writing architecture. Recent projects of Nana include the Victoria and Albert Museum's Applied Arts Pavilion, Tropical Modernism, Architecture and Power in West Africa at the 18th International Architecture Exhibition in Venice, Althea McNish, Color is Mine at the William Morris Gallery in London and the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester, as well as the Archi Africa Pavilion in Venice, and Common Communal Community, an exhibition at Magazine in Vienna that was launched recently, that was designed and curated by Yaa Projects and shows ongoing research focused on the African compound house as a communal housing typology. Alongside her practice, Nana also teaches at the Architectural Association and Kingston School of Art, and she has lectured widely in the UK and internationally. And her general interests include questions on diaspora, identity, geography, communality, and domestic particularity, and how these subjects encounter, align, and manifest through architecture and space. So especially with the last sentence, you can see where we think there are really interesting synergies of having these two wonderful women in conversation about their specific research and spatial practices. And just in terms of the format of today, we'll give Soraya the opportunity to give an opening statement that situates a little bit more the project of kind of occupations as practices of South design, or planetary occupations, as we've called it on the poster. And then Nana will give a response. And then both Kenny and I will engage the two in a few rounds of questions. And we'll also open it to questions from the audience. This we will primarily do through the Q&A function. If you want to ask a question or comment directly, then please indicate this to Tsepo, who is also online. He will be attending to the comments and the chat. So we can also unmute you and you can ask your questions kind of verbatim. But you're also more than welcome to ask them in writing. And without further ado, Soraya, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Laura. So I do have some photos, but I think I'm going to begin with my notes, and then we can move on to the photos if we have time, or do that later. Okay, so I will be speaking to this notion of occupations as practices of self-design and planetary futures. To begin, what do we mean by occupation? So occupation of vacant land and buildings has accelerated in the context of a global housing crisis and increasing precarity. This is, in fact, like I said, global, but really something that is very much a presence in cities of the global south, where, as people like Edgar Peterson and Abdul Malik Simone have stated, are sites where the majority hold vulnerability. So within these conditions, people seek out places to live where they're facing both uncertainty and precarity. And within this space, occupations have become really ways in which life-making and homemaking is taking place. It can be understood as a direct claiming and remaking of vacant space, carried out without the consent of what we might define as the formal property owner. And so in that way, arguably, occupations are really an attempt to claim the right to housing and simultaneously disrupt normalized notions of property relations. And in so doing, they really provoke foundational questions about city making and future imaginaries, really forcing us to reflect on questions that are so central to how we come to make the city across past, present, and future, asking the city for whom and by whom, and to what effect. So in taking this understanding as a starting point, our project recognizes occupations as a necessary and an immediate response to housing precarity, as well as precarious entities in themselves. At the same time, we are interested in occupation as a transgressive or a subversive practice, so foundationally disruptive to normalized spatial orders, and potentially then opening toward more emancipatory urban life worlds. So it's a question of world making in the now and into the future. As sites reflective of exclusion, ongoing social material struggle, but also of defiance and endurance, we hold the view that there's much to learn from these spaces, to learn from them about design, about experimentation, incrementality, repair, and ultimately really about an advancing an ethics that is life-affirming within or despite state-sanctioned abandonment. So our intention here is not to romanticize occupations. We agree with David Madden when he says that urban life in its current configuration seems almost intentionally designed to be draining. And yet, occupations or modes of makeshift urbanism are the city for many. So in this project, which began almost 4 years ago, we have held an overarching interest in occupations as a remaking of vacant or abandoned spaces and as a mode of life and city making, specifically with an interest in the possibilities of making the city otherwise. This work and relationships have largely been anchored in Cape Town at the Cissie Gool House occupation, which was formerly a hospital and abandoned more than 2 decades ago. So that's really where I will focus my discussion today, but I would also like to highlight, or it's worth mentioning, that alongside the focus on Cissie Gool House, we have also sought to gradually, over time, advance a comparative engagement in dialogue both with academics and their movement partners in Sao Paulo, Bogota, and more recently also Dublin and Vienna. So an effort to cut across global North and South geographies in terms of a comparative urban conversation. The situated and comparative agenda has been slow, I think inevitably, continues to evolve, and is absolutely necessarily collaborative work, and I would say time-consuming work. But returning to Cape Town, where I will focus now, which has really been the anchor of this project, the largely vacant Woodstock Hospital was occupied by the Reclaim the City movement in 2017 in the context of gentrification in the Woodstock and Salt River neighborhood, where the building is located, and also within a wider context of housing affordability or housing affordability crisis. The occupation itself began initially as a political tactic to contest the sale of public land for the development of a private school, as opposed to a call for well-located affordable housing in the nearby wealthy neighborhood of Sea Point. So it was really an attempt to hold the city into account by occupying both the Woodstock Hospital and a neighboring building, which was the Helen Bowden Nurses' Home, consequently renamed Ahmed Kathrada House, and in Woodstock, the building was renamed Cissie Gool House. So in both instances, the act of occupying sought to bring into view and at the same time challenge the stubborn racial and spatial apartheid of the city, essentially a colonial present, which continues to haunt the city. However, in the years since then, since 2017, Cissie Gool House has become a home for over 1,000 people or more than 350 families, the majority of whom joined the house after they were evicted from the gentrifying surrounding neighborhoods, all of whom cannot afford formal rental housing in the area. And in the act of occupying, they refuse to be sent to the outskirts of the city to what the city referred to as alternative accommodation, essentially state-constructed shacks like Blikkiesdorp and Wolverrivier. So following the initial act of occupation, 6 years later, Cissie Gool House continues. It continues to endure. And I would say not only endure, but it is really a site of experimentation and ongoing material and effective labor. Over time, an important part of the occupation has centered on the ways in which residents have engaged in infrastructural transformations, physical repurposing of the site, which includes cleaning, repairing, and maintaining the building, which, as I'd mentioned, was built to function as a hospital, so for a very different purpose, and at the time of occupation had also fallen into disrepair. So there was a lot of reworking, repurposing, cleaning, reimagining of that site to ultimately make it into a space for home. This work, this physical work, this labor has included connecting infrastructure networks, fixing leaks, renovating existing spaces for new uses, and creative collective cooking arrangements, as well as ongoing work within a garden. These actions, what can be referred to as perhaps material repair, have also been accompanied by collective practices, including internal governance structures that are key sites for democratic experimentation and responses to the internal and the external challenges of the occupation. These structures include a movement coordinating committee, which functions both across Cissie Gool House and Ahmed Kathrada House, and then within the house leadership formations, which include house leaders, chapter leaders, and monitors within the building, as well as a range of other spaces in which collective dialogue takes place. These include house meetings at key moments, for example, when they've encountered police raids. These are the moments when house meetings are called and residents engage around how to respond. At the same time, whilst these practices of material repair as well as democratic experimentation are taking place within the house, the City of Cape Town itself has put forward a vision of social housing on the site, for which they recently received heritage approval. This view of social housing perceives the current residents really as the biggest obstacle to the realization of what can be understood as a state-sanctioned planning vision, a vision from the top. At the same time, residents have not simply accepted this vision, and from 2020 to 2021, they have been engaged in an internal process conceived of as a process of co-design, which was initiated within the house, but with the support of the Cape Town Commoners Project, which is a group that has been allied with some of the leadership structures within Cissie Gool House. The focus has been on reimagining a long-term solution for the occupation and has included a process of resident dialogues, oral histories, and discussions on housing visions and models that would support future tenure security. So these processes are not complete. They're currently ongoing, and they have included very recently in this year in June, an exhibition at the Cape Institute of Architects, which is really in the center of the city. It was an attempt to bring the story of Cissie Gool into other spaces of the city of Cape Town. And I think what I'd like to say is that these practices, this notion of co-design is being advanced in the realm of the idea of the production of a future for the house and really focusing on experimenting with alternative governance structures and notions of participation and alternative notions of who designs, who is the designer, what constitutes design. The argument in the co-design process is really for taking occupiers seriously as residents and also as spatial actors, not only as actors within the house itself, but as spatial actors within the city, in undertaking the work of envisioning, of planning, and of remaking not only the building itself, but really the inherited urban landscapes of the past and of the present to work toward alternative futures. And this is being done, interestingly, I would say, working both with, in some ways, with, beyond, and against the state, which I think would make for an interesting conversation. Before I conclude, I just want to say something a bit about how we have worked within the project and from my perspective as a scholar within this project. So our engagement with Cissie Gool House has been defined first and foremost by a commitment to support their struggle, which we understand as part of a wider and a global housing justice struggle. We have supported their insurgent planning practices, which include, but I would say also extend beyond this co-design process, which I briefly referenced. Our approach has led us to a form of scholarship which values engagement, modesty, improvisation, and experimentation. And I would say, actually, in many ways, these practices, in terms of how we've thought of our scholarship, really mirror the types of practices that are unfolding in the occupation as a process. And in this sense, the notion of situated solidarities advanced by Routledge and Derrickson does well in capturing the ways we have sought to engage, which is slow and steady and necessarily adaptive. In this work, we have produced at least 2 outputs in collaboration with some of the residents of Cissie Gool House. One of these outputs is what we've termed a zine, sort of a mini magazine that captures the histories and brief reflections from 14 residents, and has been developed as a photographic portrait style output. I can show you a PDF version of that later if there's interest. And then a second output developed in collaboration with a filmmaker has been a short documentary, which also includes a glimpse into occupations in Bogota and Sao Paulo alongside Cissie Gool House in Cape Town. I mentioned these outputs in the conversation around scholarship, also in relation to occupations, because I think that there's room for these types of outputs to also set in motion openings towards dialogue and counter-narratives. And these can also be quite powerful in supporting political struggle. So in conclusion, more recently, we've also been engaging with CGH leadership structures and link partners to support the co-design process, and more broadly to support efforts to develop a counter vision in relation to the top-down vision that the city is advancing. We've also been trying to, over time, capture some of the material and effective labor of the residents in repairing and remaking the occupation. And I would argue that some of what is taking place there should really be thought about in relation to the idea of reparative planning. So it's not just repair, material repair, but it's efforts to think about something that perhaps bridges a little more closely to notions of reparations, which is to account for the past, specifically our racialized exclusionary cities, and how we should actively think about planning as also sites for not only repair, but also reparations. So ultimately, the approach that I'm speaking to, I think both what is taking place within Cissie Gool House as an occupation, but also the work that we have attempted to do within the project. So I think the parallels in these two, they've both been informed by a commitment to collectivity, to experimentation, to incrementality and repair, and ultimately with a desire to contribute to advancing an ethics that is life-affirming and acts against a colonial presence. So I would say that this praxis, both in occupations and in academia, simultaneously can support struggles for spaces where acts of care and acts of radical love, to actually quote one of the residents and leaders of Cissie Gool House, make life and home. And then to quote Ruth Wilson Gilmore, hopefully open up to spaces where freedom is a place. So that's where I will conclude, and I can show you the photos later if we don't have time now. Thank you.
Beautiful, thank you. What a lovely note to end on, Soraya. Yeah, I hope you get a bit of a sense of the multi-layeredness of this project. I would now invite you, Nana, to give a bit of a response and reaction to the project.
Yeah, thank you very much, Soraya, for your presentation. And perhaps I'm just going to speak in reflection of the presentation you've just given, and also perhaps some of the themes that come out in the work that you've previously shared ahead of this discussion. And perhaps I want to start at the end, actually, with what you said about freedom being a place. And I find this really interesting, the notion of situating a kind of liberatory practice in a physical place, and the idea of the site that you're working with, Cissie Gool House, as a place that became available from a position of fighting against something that the state was trying to impose on unwillingly on citizens. So I find this idea of, I suppose, in shaping your the work that you're presenting, this idea of freedom is sort of embedded in this in the sort of key themes of kind of occupation, of vacancy, and also of commoning. There's an idea of kind of a freedom of expression there, and also I think to speak to the methodology of a kind of co-design, there's an expression of finding one's own voice and freedom through design. And so I think I really appreciate that use of the idea of freedom and finding it within a kind of spatial practice, especially when it comes to the city, especially in the kind of global south as well. I think these are really, really interesting ideas. And the idea of so perhaps I'll start with the idea of occupation as a form of design. And this for me is a really intriguing idea, because it's about the kind of being situated and sort of committed to a place. And I think when we spoke previously, we talked about the sites in which you're engaging, not only in Cape Town, but also in the method that you've set up, which looks at other cities and trying to find the specificity of those cities and how maybe they're comparable or can shape or readdress the way that you look at Cissie Gool House or Cape Town. So I find this idea of occupation is somewhat tied to being rooted in a place and really taking the time to understand the complexities of a place. And also the fact that this has been a 4-year ongoing project, which seems like it's the middle of, I think really speaks to that idea of a sort of commitment to a place and really trying to unpick it, understand it, and understand how it works. And then you also talked a bit about the kind of, in this idea of occupation, is a kind of resistance to uncertainty that I also found really interesting. So the moments of where, I suppose for me, the paradoxes of occupation, which feels very much sort of fixed, becomes entangled with the idea of uncertainty and things in flux. And I find this really interesting concept to think about in terms of the Cissie Gool House. And then to go on to the idea of vacancy, I found this really interesting, not as a way of describing emptiness, but actually of describing a sort of a response that is charged and trying to implement something radical. So I find even the kind of governance of Cissie Gool House that you spoke about, this it's not what might appear as something that is in flux or vacant, is actually something that is quite structured, really well thought out in terms of how it's able to respond not just to place, but to ideas about governance and power, and really speaking to power. So I found that also really compelling to hear in your work, how it's not just about the kind of, physical place, so the city and the house, but actually this idea of occupation and vacancy is also in the way that a place is governed, the way the place is sort of manifested through its kind of governance and occupation. And then you talked a bit about one thing I found really interesting is that it seems like Cissie Gool House is a kind of extraction of how cities and urbanisms work sort of generally, and especially in the sort of global south context. I think this is very visible in the way that you've talked about this, that the city, almost Cissie Gool House, is a kind of makeshift urbanism, which is a way of city making in the context that you're working in. I suppose one thing I'd be really interested to unpack is how this relates to other places that you're looking at, where perhaps they're much more established ways of thinking about the city, or ways that allow less of a flux in them, and what can be sort of learned from them, or kind of reactions against those as well. Because I think there's something really interesting about the ways that you set up the project to look specifically at Cape Town, but to bring in other references. It's not to kind of create these binary positions, but actually to take in some ideas, but also to reject others that don't kind of find their sort of their place in what you're looking at. Then perhaps lastly, I wanted to touch back on this idea, which I really hope we can expand on in conversation, about reparative planning. I find that really incredibly enriching terminology, actually, in terms of thinking about what it means to sort of, I suppose, find freedom and liberation in the place, and that the idea of reparations needn't be something closed, but it's actually it's repair and care. And so to extend that metaphor of reparations towards repair and caring for a kind of I think urban systems, but also global ecology, as well as how we dwell. I find this really interesting, how this idea of reparative planning can kind of hold the sort of key themes of the conversation. So those are my sort of very initial reactions to the presentation, but I'm looking forward to delving more into it through conversation and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nana. Thank you, Soraya. Again, I have a question, and maybe Soraya, you can start us off with that. Maybe something that we also discussed in kind of the pre-meeting, which is your very deliberate speaking of occupations and not squatting. And I'm wondering if you can maybe let us into your thinking there, because I think that segues also nicely into how you are also reflecting the thinking around design and how design comes into that occupation process.
Thanks, Laura, for the question. And also thank you, Nana, for all of that really enriching reflection. I look forward to, as we talk, picking up on some of the points you raised. I mean, the use of the term occupation, I think ultimately we realized we felt more and more connected to and more committed to because of its locatedness temporarily. It's temporally, so there's a temporality to it. It's not referring to an act of squatting, which I think is the term that is usually used, which might refer, I think, more to the material practice, whereas occupations feels more like a reference to the practice, but also accounts for the historical relations that lead to the current structural drivers for why people occupy, as I've defined it, the claiming of land or building that does not belong to them in the formal sense. But historically, really the reason we've held onto the term is because historically the original occupation was colonization. And really that is what continues to haunt us, as I've referred to this idea of the colonial present. It's a continual haunting. And I think it's the refusal to acknowledge that ongoing haunting and what is shaping the city, our cities, and in deeply racialized and exclusionary ways that enables current planning norms to continue as practices of apparent neutrality, but are in fact deeply violent. So that's really the thinking. It's like in the use of the terminology, the insistence on valorizing these practices as opposed to criminalizing them and locating them historically as necessary responses to structural drivers of exclusion that are in the now. So we can think about that in terms of actually existing capitalism, but that in itself is historically located. And so all of these divisions, all of the idea of property, right? The original dispossession does not go away. And so it's essential to think these practices of occupation both as necessary as acts of survival, but in fact very much in response to the ongoing normalization of that original historical but yet never-ending dispossession. So that's really why we have committed to that terminology, because of all of what it simultaneously references.
Maybe I can also come in on this point. I find that that the way that you talk about it, Soraya, are really powerful, because there's something about occupying that is speaking to power rather than kind of just being a bystander. And occupation sort of registers that there is a power imbalance, and it tries to actually speak to that, I suppose. Whereas perhaps squatting is it's sort of really, that temporality isn't something that is empowering. It's actually something that's disempowering. You're always at the sort of mercies of ownership. Whereas in something of occupation, there is a questioning of that ownership as a legitimate thing in itself. So I find that really interesting. Even the way that the terminologies that you're using as a framing for this contribute to how we think about this inhabitation.
I could maybe just say something to that. That's really beautiful. I really like the way, like so many words that you've used, like the idea of power and also legitimacy. I think this is really so key because it's like an effort to turn that stuff on its head, right? Because in fact, the insistence that the act of occupation is criminal and disorderly delegitimizes those people that come to occupy out of necessity for survival. It delegitimizes them, and it completely takes away the recognition of their presence and their humanity, really, in that space. It's in the language of illegitimacy through current planning and legal norms. What happens is that people's presence and their legitimacy comes to be eroded. And so I really like that you pick up on this idea that it's the questioning of the legitimacy of ownership itself, of property relations itself, which is essentially turning that notion of who is legitimate on its head.
Maybe building on that, I think, now that we have such a strong definition and conceptualization of occupation, I wonder if you can both reflect on what it means to frame that or to claim that as design. Maybe both what it allows and also what it might obscure or what its drawbacks might be. I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Soraya.
Okay, I mean, for me, in thinking about, which I think I tried to like kind of point to in the opening statement, when I think about occupations as design, it's about the transgressive and subversive element of it, that it is, if to think with Thoronak Murivtab, it's the insurgency. It's something that, like, in a way acts against who we think is the expert and who acts in the making of the city. Again, this idea of legitimacy. And so in the attentivity, which Nana picks up on, in the effort to be attentive to a place, what I've really tried to honor in that practice is to pay attention not only to the ideas of repurposing, so how you might take an infrastructure and remake it, but actually there's so many layers to the labor of enduring in a space for 6 years. So it's repurposing an infrastructure, but it's also effective. It's not only material, it's also effective. It's the social relations, it's the care. So in that sense, repair is also care. But again, all of these are different layers of ongoing labor that happen at different scales and sites within the building itself. And I think all of that is design. There's a thoughtfulness to it. There might be, in some ways, there's an immediacy to it. And in other ways, there's so much discussion and conversation and debate in how decisions are made and how things move. That is, I would think, I'm not a planner or designer, but that looks to me like design in the really fundamental sense of making the city. And so I think it allows for a very different notion of making, of planning, of democracy in a much more expansive sense.
Yeah, I suppose to follow up on that, I think of occupation as design because it's a framework and it's setting up something that allows different parts of design, and whether it's designing the physical or designing the other things that surround it that allows the physical to be manifested. So I think even in thinking about the kind of co-design process, it's not necessarily the outputs that matter, It's actually the frameworks it provides for people to talk through matters of the city, matters of occupation, matters of dwelling. Those are that for me is the enriching part of thinking about occupation as design. It is in the kind of frameworks, it's in the kind of world building, it is in the kind of legitimizing kind of transgressive practices of occupation that it becomes design. So in some ways, to put it simply, I think that occupation is design because it's the doing, it's the sort of practice of it that makes it design. It's not it's harder. Well, I think it's less useful as a kind of it's not a design language. It's very much a kind of physical interaction or situatedness with a place. That's where for me it becomes a really useful way of thinking of useful as a designer to think about occupation.
Wonderful. Thank you to the both of you. And I love, Soraya, how you frame this kind of premise the durability of design on the durability of social relations. I think that is really powerful. And at the same time, I think what both of you are also showing is what language are we attaching to design that makes design, that almost defamiliarizes common sense notion of design. And just to kind of reference back to our opening roundtable, also this idea of linking design to notions of claim making, legitimacy, as something very practical, designing as an act rather than the design as an object. But also at the same time, what I'm asking myself is if you can both maybe expand a little bit more about the connection between repair, reparations, care, and how to square that, I guess, with designerly language and designerly practice. And I mean, Soraya, in your case particularly, how this co-design process has been conceptualized and brought about at Cissie Gool House, and how it's been used, how it's been leveraged in very kind of practical terms.
Thank you, Laura. So, I mean, I think just to talk about the co-design process first, and then I will bring that back to these bigger questions about repair, reparations, and care. I mean, I think the co-design process is something that in our initial conversation, I also perhaps indicated is something that I'm still trying to make sense of. So it's at the same time a part of these insurgent planning processes that I began to speak to, and I think in some ways is happening in parallel to. So there's a blurring in these notions of thinking about planning and design and disrupting how we think about planning and design. I think the co-design process is in itself still in the making. It's very much a process, as you were saying, this idea that it's more of an act than an object. But in looking at it, it looks different as an act, as a process, rather than an object, which began in 2021. It looks different to what had begun in 2017. So I think the planning and the repurposing and the remaking of the building by the residents from the 2017 moment was about both the material remaking of the building, the reimagining it, and repurposing a hospital into these pieces to make rooms, to make a home. But specifically, the co-design process was initiated not entirely through the acts of the residents themselves in partitioning parts of the building, but has really come about in attempt to put forward a vision for the house as a counter vision to the vision that the city is proposing for social housing, which very likely would result in mass eviction of the residents, because the majority of the residents wouldn't qualify for social housing. So this co-design process has involved some of the residents in a coordinating committee. It has involved some of the leadership, but has also involved other actors from outside of the house. So an architect, members of the Commoning project that I mentioned. So I think there are a whole range of actors that are sort of converging in the space and are over time dialoguing and sort of figuring out how through a process they construct what they might call a counter vision. And I think that in that process, there's both something interesting, which appears to be subversive and transgressive, but there's also a complexity in the questions of who is in the room, who is directing the process, and also questions around expertise. As I mentioned, there are architects in the room, there are other people who would hold what we would think about as traditional notions of planning expertise. So I think the co-design is an interesting site because it's neither top-down planning vision from the states, nor is it something that is explicitly resident-driven and unfolding in the everyday remaking of the space. There's something in between taking place there that is not fully figured out yet, but is also reflective of both the possibility of constructing a future where residents can potentially still be in that house and remain, because there's a threat of eviction, which is where this idea of both stability and uncertainty holds at the same time. But there's also, I would say, there's a risk, because of the multiple voices in the space, there's a risk of crowding out the voices of the residents, and for certain actors to direct what might be called a counter vision. So in that sense, it feels to me like quite a complex terrain. And so I think it raises a number of questions of all the actors in that space, but still being figured out. I haven't come to this point of repair and reparation. I don't know if perhaps I could give Nana a chance, and then we can come back to these ideas, which are two things that I'm actively thinking about. Yeah,
I suppose I find this this idea of co-design really interesting, because perhaps also from the London context, it shares similarities with what you're discussing, and it also has kind of counterparts. And I can see it from a London perspective. It becomes really interesting in how co-design has now become something that's actually codified towards the delivery of housing, and where it has its strengths and where it has its weaknesses, because there is something about the looseness of the practice that allows it to be transgressive, to be something that reimagines otherwise. Whereas in the context I understand it in, it's becoming something that perhaps, because it's been able to be codified, actually risks what you've been described, what you would really put well in the end there, saying that maybe it legitimizes other voices over those of the residents. So actually what ends up happening is something that shifts from what the residents imagine towards something that the state or other actors can live with. So I find co-design it's a really interesting act of designing, because it has to kind of engage with expertise, which are necessary, but also sort of pause on expertise and allow other voices to come in. And that tension is where actually can be really fruitful, but where it starts to maybe become a kind of standardized thing is where the sort of failings occur. But I suppose maybe that's my kind of sort of take on the method, or the design, the co-design as a design tool. But I suppose to the question of repair, reparations, and care, I suppose I think about those three as really quite interlinked. I suppose to start with reparations is to think about sort of forming a more positive future, one that addresses history. And I think that's something that I think is really important in this question of repair as well, that there's an active reading of history that's embedded in that. It's not seeking to kind of move forward without actually really looking and understanding the background from which we're working. And so I think this for me, repair and reparations are very much linked, in that both of them are acknowledgement of sometimes quite problematic and tough histories, but also using those as points of reflections towards a more equitable future. And care for me is is the act. So I really enjoyed how you brought in this question of radical love into your presentation, Soraya, because it feels like that is the starting point of a truly reparative practice, one that centers care, one that centers repair. It is, maybe it sounds really blue sky thinking, but it starts from a place of love. It starts from a place of understanding what the condition of being human. It starts from the position of thinking about dwelling. It starts from the position of really appreciating that housing is a right that we all have. And if that's unquestionable, then we can move towards, well, how do we provide that in a kind of, in a way that cares not just us ourselves, but the ecology in which we sort of dwell? How do we do that in a way that acknowledges care for the environment? How do we do that in a way that acknowledges care for the materials we use? So I think that this idea of repair, reparations, and care really somehow all come back to this idea of a kind of sort of radical love as a way of thinking about kind of placemaking. Sorry, that got very cheesy, but I think there's something really important in there.
Yeah, I love every word. I mean, I completely agree with you. And I think it's, the idea of radical love, firstly, just to acknowledge that this term came from Karen, one of the residents and leaders at Cissie Gool House. And she was insisting on two things. She was saying, firstly, Cissie Gool House is a space of care out of necessity. And really the work that they're doing is both. So I've been thinking about the work that they're doing as foundationally about refusal, which in itself is a very deep historically located politics. To refuse displacement is also to refuse erasure. But I think the other side of that is all of the different kinds of labors that I've been referencing, linked to that is exhaustion. And I've seen that so many times in all of the spaces within Cissie Gool House that I've interacted in. It's the everyday work of just sustaining life is exhausting. And then there's the work of the governance structures and the decision-making and the struggle to both maintain and take care internally within the building, but also in relation to the external pressures that are constantly there, sort of threatening this apparent view of fixity. There's always the precarity underlying it. But in holding it in place is the labor, right? Which is exhausting. But I think what she was saying is that at the core of that, and the practice of continually ongoing or going in spite of it all, is the radical love. And I completely agree with you that if we were to center notions of life affirmation, of equality, of humanity, and radical love in all of our praxis, that would fundamentally change how we operate. It would fundamentally change notions of who designs, how we design, what we design for, what we plan for. It would be a much more equitable, inclusionary city. So it sounds sort of blue sky, as you say, but actually it's so central. And really, I would say it's a shift in the valorization, right? Because currently, what are we valorizing? We're valorizing destruction. And inhumanity, really, the idea that Mbembe puts forward as well of necropolitics, that's what we are valorizing, the devaluation really of Black life. And so I think that's also where this idea of paying attention to these subversive practices, which are also the practices of Black actors in the making of the city. We need to knit these things together. We need to knit together the idea of who is the spatial actor, what are we valorizing, and how do we put in the center humanity, care, love, as things that are really so foundational to the lives and the life and the world we want to construct. And so for me, that is really where care, repair, and reparations come together. And I completely agree with you, Nana, that it's an accounting of the past in thinking about the present and in the making of the future, which is the opposite of erasure.
Maybe if I may since you both agree so much, I'm going to try and, create some tension here, and ask if perhaps, as on the other side of this, if we consider this community not as a kind of singular or organic one, but also one shaped by internal tensions, differences, exclusions, how these systems of attribution of space internally work, how work is distributed, how this very exhausting work is maintained, and then maybe also in relationship to your position, how you work across these differences and what solidarity across difference means in practice, in doing that. Thanks. Soraya, I think that's a question for you, but feel free, Nana, as well.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really fantastic question, and we're getting into the detail of it, right? So there's the bigger picture, which I would still hold on to. So in making the argument, all of the arguments I've made about the occupation and how it is reflective of transgression, essentially transgression of the normalized notions of property and what all of that implies, I would hold on to those arguments, including the idea that the governance structures themselves are in some ways prefigurative. But having said all of that, of course, it's messy. Of course, it's so tense. And if you have 1,000 residents, there's no way there can really be a flat structure. So there's a vision of a flat structure as opposed to something more vertical in the decision-making or hierarchical in the decision-making. But in practice, it doesn't play out that way. There are certain actors that become quite central, sometimes because of their own histories and their own training have given them certain capacities, certain understandings of the spaces in which they're operating. They become more political actors in a sense. They have the language, they understand the legal terms, they can navigate both the spaces internally and externally. So you see certain actors rising, becoming more vocal, and influencing how the occupation itself runs not only on a daily basis, but also the decisions that are taken around litigation processes, for example, or the managing of various sections. And that certainly creates tensions within the house. I think what you also see is that there's certain kinds of allegiances or alliances that play out where some sections or some actors are more committed to certain leaders and would follow their direction as opposed to somebody else's direction, another leader's direction. So I think these are somewhat inevitable aspects of attempting to construct notions of governance within a space that now includes people that previously were living in privatized dwellings, like, just like a single notion of a home. So you have something that is much more porous and blurred. It's not just the home where you close your door, but something much more blurred. There are also other tensions that I think go beyond the governance. So it's just the everyday relationships. If you're living in a common space, things like children making a noise or being outside at certain times, these are some of the things that I think those of us living in homes where you close the door and your neighbor is not that visible, those are dynamics we don't have to grapple with, but they become quite central in spaces that are defined by more commonality in the interactions. How to navigate that as a researcher, I think, is a very, very difficult question, because it raises a whole range of questions. Like, one of the things that I have tried actively to not do is to become a social movement scholar who adopts a detached gaze and documents the practices of the movement with a view to critique. I think there's a lot that could be said about what is functioning and what is not functioning. But I don't really see the political utility of adopting that position in the work that I do. I could do that, but that's not the lens that I've chosen to take or the aspects that I've chosen to actively write about, because I think that would simply serve my own academic interest, but not necessarily contribute to really the lives of 1,000 people. So so that's kind of the position I've taken. Like I can see the complexity, I can see the messiness in the relationships. I engage individuals, some of them in the leadership, some of them are people that I've simply developed friendships with in the house as a result of spending time in the garden or spending time in the kitchen. But in the conversations I have and the spaces where I put my energy and my effort, it's been sometimes in spite of what I hear, but always asking myself, as a scholar, where do I put my efforts and in what direction? So I think that I've made choices also about what I don't really delve into. Yeah. I'm open to hearing more, but I'm just kind of expressing my ongoing figuring out of how one works in a space like this and how you do that ethically.
Yeah, great. I mean, that's exactly what I was gonna ask you and what we're maybe also getting into, because I think there are a lot of parallels between the ethos and the ethics of practicing engaged scholarship and the ethos and ethics of being, I guess, an engaged designer and designing with rather than for, right? I see quite a lot of parallels in this grappling. And maybe, I don't know, Nana, how you're doing with the plugging in of your laptop, if you feel like you want to jump in here also as somebody who is, kind of in the practice as, kind of a spatial designer and spatial practitioner.
Yeah, sorry, I think that's I'm hoping that the noise in the back is not too subversive. I suppose this question of, I think what we're really talking about is kind of, again, maybe back to kind of power through and how that manifests in design. I think going back to this question of co-design is something that my own practice and working in kind of housing and urban design really has made quite pertinent in my mind, the role of the design in articulating the visions of others, and that you are not necessarily the one, you are acting as an instigator or a translator, but that comes with a real responsibility not to necessarily speak over or cannibalize the aspiration of others. And in sort of in doing so, I think about this again, I think that of the usefulness of setting up frameworks for these discussions, or that the designing or the occupation or the translation is a framework. What goes into it is what then allows it for myself, especially as a designer. These are the ingredients I'm able to work with. These are the concerns that I'm able to manifest in the work that I'm doing. And so, yeah, I think this conversation about, for me, what's sort of holding this together in response to Kenny's question is the responsibility as a designer in how we think about occupation, how we think about city making in a kind of reparative or restorative way as well. So I think to sort of summarize that point, I think as a designer, for me, it's an act of translation, and it's an act as a kind of go-between of the kind of aspirations of other people that are living in a place or their commitment to a place, and translating that and manifesting that spatially and materially as well. And I think this dialogue is really interesting to me, because one thing that is key here, I think, is that Soraya's work is not just dealing with the physical kind of presence, but it's also dealing with the kind of logistical, it's dealing with the kind of governmental, it's dealing with the structural that then help the physical be manifested. And I think those things are really important to the conversation as well, that kind of how the physical is shaped by questions of logistics, governance, who has the knowledge, who feels that they can contribute to the question. I think these are all things that as creative practitioners, we should think about also in designing. We have to design for these systems to work as best as they can.
Fantastic. And I mean, now to kind of also, I want to start kind of pulling on some of the threads that are coming through also in the Q&A box. And I would, encourage everybody who's attending to also feel free to come in on that. But kind of to lift it to the scale of, I guess, the planetary, and how, you know, we can conceive of these solidarities and commoning pushes that, you know, you capture so beautifully, Soraya, in Cape Town. Also, you know, in other locales, and you managed, like, you talked across kind of Bogota, Sao Paulo, now taking this to Dublin, to Vienna. Nana, you also have experiences now, you know, with your recent exhibition in Vienna, to kind of how you see this as speaking to a planetary conversation around, I guess, the value of occupations, and the different ways in which it's not only about kind of housing occupation of vacant infrastructure, but also vacant land, right? And how that links to land rights and global solidarities. And I think there are quite a few threads we can maybe pull on to also maybe enliven again this discussion that we had in the first roundtable around the misconceptions of the planetary, that it's often detached from the local, which it actually isn't, right? The planetary is very much embedded in local practice. And yeah, so I'm wondering what you are thinking about this, and how you would link these detailed studies to kind of more planetary notions of commoning and occupation. Yeah.
Nana, would you like to go, or?
Yeah, I can maybe jump in there. I suppose my first reaction to that is I really like this idea of the planetary as the local, that it's not kind of detached from it. I think that's a really excellent kind of way into this, because I think that I think of Taya Selassie, who's a writer, gave this talk and this presentation, actually it was a paper first, where she talks about being local to a place, but also you know, being a kind of, not a global citizen, but a kind of somebody of the diaspora, and the kind of moments where locality is really the thing that enforces this idea of the kind of larger scale, how we occupy a place. And I think that this idea of the kind of planetary scale versus the local, in some ways they are kind of working at different scales, but also it's at the same scale at once. So I'm thinking about the planetary as a series of kind of locals. They are moments which we know very well, and we can really be invested in. And that kind of understanding of a place in its local, most immediate context is what might actually help us think about a kind of larger scale. Because I'm thinking of, Soraya, the way that you've set up these things, to really understand the local context of a place is where then I think we can draw comparisons or kind of questions that kind of go between the place. So I think the question of the local within the planetary, in some ways, I think of the planetary as a series of locals. They're a series of deeply embedded questions that relate to a very specific place. And by understanding that, you know, that specific nature of a place, we're able to maybe extract, or, well, maybe extract is the wrong word here, but we're able to extrapolate kind of meanings that maybe are also applicable to other places, or also at the same time appreciate differences, which mean that we're able to reflect much more meaningfully on the local context as well. So I just said that to kind of open up this really, I think it's really interesting, this idea of the sort of juxtaposition of scales, which actually is sort of closer than maybe the sort of language suggests in some ways.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I really, in the conversation that we'd had previously, and you mentioned from the last discussion, this idea of the planetary was really interrogated. And in fact, a movement beyond the notion that we're talking about different levels of scale. And that really resonates with me. I think for me, I've always been much more interested in notions of relations, which allows you to draw connections across actors and spaces, beyond notions of how we might traditionally think about scale as something that is local or global. Relations cuts across that idea much more effectively, and I think opens up how we think about both. It allows an attentiveness to the situated, to the everyday, to what might look like the mundane. It insists on that attentiveness, but it also insists that we elevate our understanding beyond that. So we are simultaneously attentive and we elevate understanding so that we can cumulatively make sense. But I think the practice of making sense is about more than that, right? So it's partially, so in this work that I just briefly mentioned, so we're anchoring in Cape Town, but we have really, at the same time as doing something situated and attentive, we've really tried to slowly advance a comparative dialogue. I would call it a dialogue. It's exchange. But the intention in that is to recognize that each site has a story to tell, but in conversation and in the listening and in the exchange, there's some learning that can take place, which can travel across. In some ways, it's the translation that Nana was referencing previously. And in the translation, there's revisability, which is, I think, also where Jennifer Robinson, when she talks about comparative urbanism, she talks about revisable concepts. It's ongoingly revisable in the dialogue, in the comparison. And so really that is the interest in why we are advancing comparison as much as situatedness, because it allows us to pay attention, but it allows us at the same time to not get stuck in a singular focus. It's additive. And I think in the additiveness, there's something that is like a cumulative assembling and reassembling, which in our project is not only about sense making, but it's about how we use that to contribute to world making. So that kind of is what the planetary means to us. It's how the project itself, in the cumulative sense, in the exchange, in the conversation, is advancing emancipatory world making. And for me, that's where this matters. You know, we live. I think the conversation of the planetary very much is also in connection to the notion that we are in a world that is defined by polycrisis in various senses. And so that's also partially where the connections can be drawn. If we advance this type of methodology, then we recognize polycrisis as structurally driven in place, but also connected across place. And therefore, there's room to think about what else needs to step in to counter that, to make something else. So yeah, that's kind of the thinking. And I think this also comes to these ideas of solidarities. And as you were saying, Laura, talking about land rights and vacancy, there's so many different specificities per site, but I think cumulatively, it's about making a different kind of world. And the drivers of what are holding us in place, there's certainly common threads that we all need to surface and hold in conversation with each other.
Wonderful. I think Kenny had a question on the land as in particular.
Yeah, maybe to follow up, since you mentioned this comparative move, if you could speak a little bit about how we might understand the kind of racial regimes of property and land ownership in other contexts, and how how that shapes occupation. Cape Town strikes me as a particular colonial present, as you call it, but in other contexts, post-colonial contexts, land ownership is often contested between different owners, or because there are no title deeds, and because colonial administrations were, of course, very selective in assigning who was given a title deed, and that shapes very much the contested nature of land ownership in post-colonial contexts, in Ghana or other places. So I'm wondering if you can say something about how we might think about comparing different regimes of land ownership or different property regimes, and conceptualize occupations from there.
Yes, I can't speak to Ghana, but I can speak to what we saw in Sao Paulo. and in Bogota. And I mean, both of these are sites that do have a history of colonialism, of land dispossession, of essentially displacement from the land, and specific notions of what constitutes property. But over time, there's also, as you say, there's been contestation and revisions about notions of ownership. So I think specifically Brazil is an interesting case in that their constitution in many ways mirrors ours, but they have the specific built-in notion of the social function of property, which is absent in the South African constitution. So we have the idea of the right to housing, but there's several caveats that follow that idea of the right to housing. So within the capacity of the state to realize, progressive realization, whereas in this instance, if we're dealing with vacant property and it's standing vacant for a period of time, there is the possibility to invoke the idea of the social function of property, which is really this contestation between exchange and use value. And that's built into the Constitution. And I think that's really like one example of where we might be able to trace similar histories of dispossession and notions of like the construction of property relations, including racialization, but how that plays out in the contemporary form and how the Constitution itself is reused, or the malleability, I suppose, of legal mechanisms becomes a really interesting conversation in that comparative effort. And so that's one of the things we have been doing. We've been trying to read in very concrete ways the ways in which Brazilian movements have been making use of actual instruments, legal instruments, to advocate for notions of legitimacy, notions of regularization, and almost manipulate the idea of social housing that does not translate into eviction, but actually translate into very specific notions of participation that seem a little bit more expansive than what is being offered in the Cape Town context. So one of the efforts that we're involved in at the moment is to look at these instruments, the practices, and the trajectories, because the trajectory is also different. I think what I'm trying to say is that it's not a straight line. There's the maneuverability that happens in the practice per story, even in a single city. So we're trying to trace different trajectories of what outcomes have been in certain occupations and to make sense of what strategies have been made use of, including playing around with the notions of private property and how that is partially opened up through the law, and see how that might translate into the South African context. Also to inform movement strategy, not only in the case of Cissie Gool House.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think there's a lot to kind of sort of unpick there. And I suppose maybe it's a good opportunity to bring in some of my own research work around compound housing and looking at that as not as in a way as a way of looking at occupation in a very different way to say the sort of in the Ghanaian sense, the occupation of a villa or a singular family home, and the compound house as a typology is a kind of collective housing type. Typically, it's evolved over time, and now in its kind of urban configuration, it's very much locally it's referred to as a passenger house. So it's this kind of continuous overturn of kind of different occupants, but historically would have been a kind of a sort of way of occupying a place by clan rather than perhaps by just kind of individual nuclear families. So I think that for me, the reason I bring this up is because it invokes a very different idea of ownership. It invokes an idea of ownership that is actually communal. It does not see the house as property, but something of an institution. And I think that there are similarities there with how Soraya, your work is approaching Cissie Gool House. It's less about the kind of it's more than just the idea of kind of housing provision, but really seeing housing and its application to the city as a way of setting up a kind of institution. It's setting up something that is beyond just one person or body. It's something that it becomes a tool about thinking about, kind of equitable placemaking. And I suppose for me, the house or the compound house is it's a useful analogy for thinking about ownership and thinking about how ownership is also incremental, how it can change, how it needs to change to adapt to people's growing needs, or I find it really interesting, housing typology, because it literally responds to kind of growth and certain pressures. It can shrink, it can be occupied in a kind of temporary nature. In the Ghanaian context, this is really important because people sort of historically were built with kind of by means, what they had, so that have grown their houses as they needed to. And that kind of way of building where it's additive means that actually occupation can start before something is complete. And I find that is for me a real mirror of kind of city and placemaking. It's always ongoing. It's never really complete. How do we say a place has been made and that's it? It's this kind of continued adaptation, which for me, that continued adaptation calls directly into question the idea of ownership. It's a kind of it sort of reveals the kind of slight spectacle of kind of complete sealed ideas of ownership in a kind of urban sense.
Wonderful, thank you. It reminds me also a little bit about this notion of radical incrementalism, right? That I think Edgar Peterson and others have been toying with, and also kind of, I guess, the political limitations of that as well, because in this incremental way, you're kind of always at different stages of building, and it's sometimes difficult to build these kind of networks of solidarity and community around it. At this stage, I mean, we have about 25 minutes left on the clock, and I was wondering if there are any kind of comments or hands from the floor. You can raise your hand, we can unmute you, so you can give us your comment or your question. Otherwise you can also put that in the Q&A box. So let's see if there's any show of hands.
I think there was also a question about Basel, which might be a question for us. So maybe we can do that at the end, or we can do that briefly now, not to
I mean, taking the liberty of the moderator, I think we can take this question at the end, because there's a question also about how this project fits within the broader South Designs program. There is a lovely question by Noor about asking us to think about the interplay between occupation and heritage making, including the role of documenting this, the process, and how this reconfiguration, I guess, is also a form of memory work, maybe, and these are my added words now, and not Noor's, but Noor, I hope I'm capturing your question. And I think how, again, history and the reclaiming of history plays an important role in occupation, and maybe this also emphasizes the use of occupation vis-a-vis the use of squat as the language we and you, Soraya, and your project are deliberately using.
Yeah, could I maybe come in on that? It's, I mean, I haven't mentioned heritage, but it's actually quite a central conversation at Cissie Gool House. The one thing I did say is that the City of Cape Town has recently received heritage approval to proceed with this vision of social housing that they are proposing. But in that process of going through the heritage impact assessment approval process, there was, in the co-design conversation, a session held around the documentation of oral histories, and specifically reflecting on the location of Cissie Gool House within the larger Woodstock area, which I mentioned is a gentrifying area of the city. And in fact, many of the residents in Cissie Gool House would have been evicted from the neighboring streets, in fact, in Woodstock. And one of the claims that they were making is that this heritage impact assessment process was accounting for physical heritage, but having no reflection on what they are referring to as living heritage, which is the intangible heritage, their generational contribution to the making of the city, the relationships, the bonds in those spaces, which are not only in the now, but over several generations, and quite central to what constitutes the identity of Cape Town and of Woodstock, the surrounding area. And so the argument was twofold, in the one sense that this lack of accounting of the heritage was the absence of accounting of their historical and generational connections to the city and to the site, and the contribution to the making of the city. And at the same time, that Cissie Gool House had become almost a placeholder within which those broken bonds through ongoing eviction was being held, or in the materiality of the building, they were actively retaining their living heritage by being in that space. And so it was an insistence that it was not only about what was being erased through eviction, but what Cissie Gool House, in the act of occupation was allowing the residents to hold onto. And therefore, there was a need to think about this as living heritage. And in my own thinking, I mean, if I can just connect that to what has been going on in Cape Town, specifically following the Roads Must Fall movement, I feel like there's very direct parallels to draw between what is being argued by the Fallist movement around what monuments stand for, and the idea of Cissie Gool House essentially almost as a counter. Not only Cissie Gool House, but I think these are the spaces that are reflective of what we should be valuing instead. So the monument itself, of course, it stands for the colonial presence, but it's also about toppling all of the things that the structural exclusions that remain, and the sense when students enter the space that they don't belong. But spaces like Cissie Gool House are very much about remembering. They're about social bonds. They are about relationships. And in that sense, it's not putting up a figure as an individual that we celebrate and give value to, and in a way actually pause history as we simultaneously forget most histories, the histories of the oppressed. That's what I think these monuments stand for, and what movements like Roads Must Fall, which then ricochet throughout the world, right? And we saw again with the Black Lives Matter movement, why the toppling of the monuments means so much more. And it might seem like a bit of an unusual comparison to make, but I think there's a very strong conversation to have there about what these spaces as a counter offer us. And instead, that's what we should be thinking about. When we think about counter monuments, in fact, we should not be thinking about objects and things that we lay to stand as a counter, but actually the relationships and the bonds and the kinds of worlds that we are trying to set up. Those are the counters that I think we need to be putting in its place, which would give a lot more value to the act of toppling the statue, because that's the first move, but it shouldn't be the singular move or where we stop.
Yeah, it's toppling the statue, and then, is there a way in which it could be replaced with more inclusive memory work around living heritage, which would then put Cissie Gool House and other occupations and other kind of living heritage more at the center of these discussions. It's a very intriguing thought. I don't know, Nana, do you have anything you want to come in on?
Yeah, I suppose I find this idea of Cissie Gool House acting as something of a living archive really interesting and really powerful, especially perhaps in its situational citing in relation to this area of gentrification. It is the kind of counter, it's the kind of memory of a place, and in some ways it becomes it becomes something of a kind of antidote to the kind of the state's memory of a place. It's the thing that the state memory is this kind of sort of codified or kind of, very manicured memory of a place, and it allows a kind of erasure. Whereas places like Cissie Gool House, if we can think about the memory as part of a kind of archive, I think that it becomes a kind of manifestation of that. It becomes a manifestation of kind of resistance towards erasure. And I think that this idea of kind of heritage and memory work is really a question of a refusal to be kind of erased out of a place and its living history. So I also think that there's something interesting in talking about heritage as a question of who gets to tell the story. Heritage is always, in my mind at least, it's the things that remained, not necessarily the things that are of greatest value. It is just what remained. And so can we add to that? Can we expand that actually, if it's not just the physical that's remained, what other things have remained? It's the memory, it's people's collective stories, it's people's collective kind of relationships. Those are also part of a kind of heritage of a place. So yeah, that's.
Yeah, and yet the remains are often what is then re-legitimizing formal histories, right? So the remaining of certain statues and memorials. So yeah, thank you. This is such an intriguing conversation. I want to actually go to the next question that was posed by Amanda Haas-Allen. And she's asking, is there currently a plan of sharing the gathered knowledge from the processes in Cissie Gool House to other places in Cape Town? Is there a horizontal pathway to educate others in how property can be occupied and how inhabitants can live together democratically? But maybe, is there also an anxiety within government, to trying, obviously, to shutting down a project like Cissie Gool House in order for it not to be replicated? Yeah, thank you, Amanda, for this question.
Yeah, I think it's more the latter, Laura. I mean, there's a lot of anxiety, which is also why efforts such as the co-design process, as you're aware, the process itself, very recently, there was an exhibition held at the Cape Institute of Architects to share the process up to this point, and in some ways to demonstrate that the residents are engaged in a dialogue around the future visioning of that site. Not only are they engaged in a dialogue around the future visioning of the site, but they have been actively engaged in the making of that space, in this practice of placemaking. And so the attempt was to document and show that so that it would be, you could enter other spaces other than Cissie Gool, and there would be a possibility for people from across the city to actually engage and understand what is going on in a space that through the mainstream media is portrayed in very specific ways as criminalizing and disorderly. But at the same time, there was an effort made to invite the city to, well, representatives from the city to attend that exhibition. That did not happen, but I think it's because there's this really great fear of setting a precedent, of if you are to engage in what is being presented to you as an active effort to collectively design, to collectively imagine, not even to do so without engagement with the state, but in some kind of dialogue, in doing so, it creates an invitation. And I think that the city is not at that point where that precedent is something that they're open to doing. So it's not really the unmooring. We talked about the unmooring of design. That's definitely not where it's at. So there's a very strong fear of what engaging with a co-design process might suggest about the potential of unmooring and the disruption of what is being and has always been normalized. On the other hand, of course, there are also processes within Cissie Gool House in exchange within Reclaim the City, with other movements, the Housing Assembly, linked to other NGOs. So that is really where the exchange is taking place, across movements, across NGOs.
Yeah, and these global kind of solidarities was also something, that was, I think, resonates with this kind of worlding discourse, right, around creating and maintaining and nurturing solidarities. And I love the language you used, Soraya, earlier around what was it, life affirming, human flourishing in that sense. And now, we can build solidarities not only around resistance, but maybe also about more positive kind of affirming notions and actions. And I think that's where a co-design process gives this platform in a way for these kind of more aspirational visioning that are still not, overly romanticizing the situation of the occupants. So we have about 10 more minutes. I'm wondering if there is any other kind of comment or question that anybody from the floor would like to raise. We can allow you to talk, or you can again put it in the chat and we can pick it up for you. Maybe let's allow a minute for this to happen.
Maybe just while that's happening, I just wanted to reflect a bit more on this, what Soraya just brought up about the way that the state reflects on kind of co-design practices. Especially, I'm finding this conversation really useful in thinking about how co-design is understood in the kind of in the South as a design tool, and how it's maybe understood in the kind of in London or in the UK as something that is useful towards a means of showing kind of consent from people in the area that is being transformed. And I find this really interesting, how there's a kind of unwillingness from the state to engage because it seems to be empowering. And I think it'd be really interesting to see how this evolves in a place like Vienna and Dublin, which perhaps think about co-design in different ways, where the state is engaging in some level with the premise that actually people should be able to kind of design a place, implements different ways of kind of living collectively together. And I'm just really interested in how this idea of co-design manifests in kind of different situations because of other things that are affected. So I think these things are affected by power, they're affected by economics, they're affected by kind of social hierarchies. And so it'd be really interesting to kind of read the idea of co-design as is affected and shifted by other things that it comes into contact with.
Yeah, and I think that also goes through to the third, kind of big ticket notion of this series, right? We've talked about the planetary, we've talked about design, but we also, kind of talking from the South, right? And then traveling this kind of North-South binary through using occupations as a lens, through using co-design as something that, can trouble this. That's probably a lovely line of inquiry to kind of end up on and tie up our conversations. Soraya, do you want to have a go at it?
Yeah, thank you. That's actually a lovely idea. So, I mean, just to say that we are, as I mentioned, we are involved in a project that is holding three thematics together. It's vacancy, occupations, and commoning. But really, commoning is something that I think we've used almost as a placeholder, in some ways to reference the making of the city otherwise. But we have these three thematic threads that are helping us to think across geographies, North and South geographies, specifically Cape Town, Sao Paulo, Bogota, and then Vienna and Dublin. And in each instance, those that we are in a conversation with have focused on parts of, or more so on one of these threads, but we also recognize that in holding them in a conversation, we can think about vacancy firstly as not emptiness. It's the appearance of emptiness. But the first question we need to ask is what lies beyond the appearance of emptiness? Speculation is one of the answers. So it appears empty, but there's a lot going on there. But there's also room to translate that appearance into so many different potentialities. And so we're interested in how that translation can be or has been observed in some instances to move towards occupation, but not occupation only as momentary, as the act, but actually as the practice, as the process, as the struggle, and as a potentiality possibly towards the making of the city otherwise. So those are the threads that we're holding, and then it allows us to think across these geographies, which then is not looking for comparison as like for like, but actually comparison as exchange, as something generative. And so, Nana, your idea that we actually read co-design is something that we had not explicitly thought about, because it's something that we're seeing in Cape Town, but not necessarily we haven't necessarily have begun that conversation around how is that translating in these other sites. But if I think about Vienna in particular, I mean, they have a long history of common housing practices. Red Vienna is a very strong illustration of how they've really thought about housing provision to be more equitable. But again, that active translation and thinking across geographies immediately makes clear it's not about taking a practice and moving it as an answer, but that does not suggest we shouldn't have an exchange and think across. And so I think that idea more explicitly of reading the idea of co-design is a wonderful provocation, and something I'm definitely going to hold on to as we continue this conversation, specifically between Cape Town and Vienna, because I think there's something there that would be really, really interesting to play with, and therefore also allow us to think about what the risks and the potentials of co-design are here, so that we also are aware of what codification might look like, right? Because I think that's something that has also been the story of the success that is Vienna. When you dig a little bit deeper, it's not necessarily a success story. There's more to it. And I think part of that is the codification. So thank you for that. That's definitely something, as we continue the comparative conversation, I'm going to hold on to. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And maybe that's also a nice segue into this last question about Basel, which is a bit of a question for us also. What's this, why is this in Basel? And I think you've already given very much the answer, Soraya, in explaining the thinking across geographies. And I think this is especially necessary from a place like Basel, which is so rooted in its ways of understanding itself, that decentering perspectives is really key, I think, to doing more original and more relevant urban research. Laura and I just came actually from a whole day of master thesis workshops where we see the fruits of I think this translation and thinking across sites by looking at Basel from perspectives such as racial land ownership regimes, which is usually not considered, or to think about its very famous iconic architecture by Herzog and de Meuron from a perspective of maintenance and the work of maintenance. To think about borders, migration, and mobility. So, I think our students illustrate also that you can think across and from far away or from elsewhere, but very much also situated and rooted and engaged with familiar places. So that I think, just as a final segue to say, comparative thinking or thinking from elsewhere is, I think, a key element of the program. And I think with that, we can maybe close. I don't know, Laura, if you want to say a few things.
Maybe just a few announcements, and first of all, a massive thank you to Soraya for presenting the project, to presenting the larger thinking about it, how it connects to South designs, to the questions of the planetary, and also thank you to Nana for coming in as such a kind of new and critical friend of the of the work that Soraya and the Cissie Gool House team are doing. And yeah, I think, this conversation has been really enriching and really wonderful, because it has brought together such synergies between, Nana, your compound house work, and Soraya, your ongoing work, obviously, with Cissie Gool House and other occupations across the globe. So thank you so much for sharing. And we've also included in the chat a few kind of resources, things where you might want to read further. If you're interested in the framing of this series, then there is an interview that Kenny and I have done with our media partners at CauseArc. There's also a lovely article that's hot off the press by Soraya and Nate Millington, which is laying out the ways in which one can actually think with Cissie Gool House within and across context. And we are also happy to share this if it's for you ending up behind a paywall. We are happy to email it to you. Yeah, we also encourage you to look up more of Nana's work, of Yaa Project's work, which is also peripatetic and everywhere. It's doing this lovely exhibition in Vienna at the moment. So yeah, keep a lookout on our critical urbanism page. There will be also write-ups on this conversation. You will be able to revisit the live recording on YouTube, which you're also welcome to share far and wide. And our next event will be on the, can you please correct me, 12th of November?
It's, the date I forget, but here's the thing in the chat. It's in a few weeks. And it's called, yeah, go ahead.
You go ahead, yeah.
Okay, it's called Reimaginations, and it'll be conversation with the team of one of the 16, the next team, in conversation with Françoise Vergès. And the focus of that conversation is going to be around the perspective of the migrant and the displaced person, as a way to understand what planetary ecology and the politics of the planetary might mean from this marginalized and often glossed over subjectivity. So we'll be discussing with Reimaginations their ongoing work with diverse migrant communities in Morocco. They foreground Black and Indigenous ecologies in practices of adaptation to often hostile environments. And from that perspective, we'll be thinking about what an ecology rooted in decolonial struggle might help us or tell us about planetary design. Thank you so much, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank
and
you
thanks
so much.
again, Soraya and Nana. It was
Thank you.
wonderful.
Thank you so much.